a bit of housekeeping before the class starts. This will be the last lecture for this class. There will not be a lecture next week, nor will there be a lecture during finals week. I have posted an announcement concerning what office hours are over the next few weeks. Be sure to read that. Sometime this week, I will be posting an announcement concerning deadlines and so on for this class. So be on the lookout for that. As always, if you have any questions about any of these, just let me know and I'll be glad to help you. The purpose of the last unit of this class is really to get you just a basic introduction to JavaScript and to show you what role the JavaScript performs on a web page. Now, the one example that we used was ESPN's website. And we said that JavaScript provides interactivity. And what do we mean by interactivity? We mean that the user does something and the page responds in some way. Now notice that today, internet connection must be a little slow because it's taken a little bit of time for everything to load up here. Finally, it loads up. I'm actually glad that happened today. Not that I'm glad to have a slow internet connection, but I'm glad that that showed you that all this code gets downloaded initially from the web server. All right, and by all this code, I mean everything to make this page work without making another request to the web server. So that is all the HTML code, all the content, including content that we don't see, gets downloaded to the web browser. The CSS then sets the visibility and JavaScript provides the interactivity. Notice that when we put the mouse over these menu selections, they appear instantaneously. They don't have to go back to the server to get more content. This content was downloaded with the initial page load, along with the CSS that makes it invisible, and along with the JavaScript that provides the interactivity. That is, you put your mouse over something, it appears. So the recipe for interactivity is this. The user does something. Now that something may be something very basic like loading the page, but it also might be somehow interacting with the mouse or the keyboard, such as the user puts their mouse over an item, the user clicks on an item, and so on. That signals JavaScript to go into effect. JavaScript uses what's called the DOM, and the DOM is a way that JavaScript can refer to different things on the page. So it can point to different items on the page, so it can do different things to the page. And then there's the actual JavaScript commands itself that change things on the page. And the examples that we went over last time were really, in their essence, simplified versions of that menu example. We went over this one where we can show the different spoilers, change the color. And we went over this one we did it with a mouse over, which very closely resembles the menus in the ESPN example. In the first spoiler example, things are triggered by user clicking on the button. And the event that starts the interactivity is the on-click event. That's a property of one of the HTML elements. In this case, it's the property of that button. On-click, and then we have a snippet of JavaScript. That JavaScript uses the DOM to point to the thing on the change we want to change, point to the thing on the page that we want to change. We want to change the thing that has an ID of spoiler 1. That's this paragraph over here. What do we want to do to it? We want to change its style, the display property of the style, and we want to make it block. Initially, it was set as none, so it didn't appear. We changed that style to block, and that makes it appear. We did the same thing with the other button here, except we pointed to this other paragraph called spoiler 2 and changed it to block. We also showed you that you can change other aspects of the page. In fact, you can change pretty much any aspect of the page simply by referring to the DOM property that controls that. Here we change the background color of that property. The other example is pretty much the same, except we changed the event. The event, instead of the on click, was on mouse over. So when the mouse goes over that paragraph, we show the spoiler paragraph. When the mouse goes out of that paragraph, we hide it again. We're going to go over a handful of other examples today that do similar things and sort of expand upon those things. So let's look at this one first. This example has a menu that when you click on the menu, it expands. That's very similar to what you get in Windows File Explorer. If we're viewing, for example, actually it's not like that. Sort of like the old school File Explorer, where when you click on it, you expand it. When you click on it again, you hide it. We can change between big text and normal text on this page. Let's look what's going on here. For the text button, we have an on-click event that sets document get element by ID main that finds the thing on the page that has an ID of main. That's this paragraph. We're going to change something about it. What are we going to change? We're going to change the style to have a font size of 2M. 2M means it's emphasized 2 times, so it's twice as big as the default. When we go back to the normal text, we set it back to 1M. Now notice in CSS, you would refer to font size as font dash size, whereas in JavaScript, you refer to it as one word with no dashes, and the upper, the first character of the second word is uppercase. All right, we do something a little bit different for the click. We call something called toggle menu. Toggle menu is what's called a function. A function allows us to take code and reuse it. For example, in our spoiler example, where we show and hide the code, or we show and hide the spoiler. We have the same instruction repeated over and over again. And if there was 100 different spoilers on the page, we would have that same line of code repeated 100 times. Well, in this particular case, it's not so bad, all right? Because it's just one line of code, and it's simple, and we could copy and paste it and probably not have much of a problem. But if it's more complicated and more involved, sometimes it's good to create a function. Now, what is a function? A function is where you take some instructions in JavaScript and give them a name. This code is put in a script tag. Just like you have style tags where you can put CSS code in your HTML page, you have script tags that allow you to put JavaScript in your page. So I've declared a function here, and I've called it toggle menu. I didn't want to do that. And what toggle menu is this. I'm going to click, if I click on this link, or actually if I click on this LI, if it is visible, I'm going to make it invisible. And if it's invisible, I'm going to make it visible. So we switch between visible and invisible. It's like a light switch. A light switch, if it's on and you flick the switch, it turns it off. If it's off and you flick the switch, it turns it on. So this is the same thing. It's a toggle. All right. So I have to say, what do I want to toggle? In other words, what am I turning on or off? You know, just like you might have multiple switches in a room, in a big room, let's say, and different switches control different lights. Well, I have to specify, what do I want to toggle? What do I want to turn on and off? And I'm going to give the ID of the thing I want to turn on and off. So if I click on this link, I want to turn on or off submenu 1. For this one, I want to turn on or off submenu 2. This one, I want to turn on or off submenu 3. Notice the syntax again. The double quotes go around the entire JavaScript statement. Within the JavaScript statement, I use single quotes to identify IDs and that sort of thing. So when I click on this link, I'm going to look and see if it's visible. If it's visible, I'm going to make it invisible. If it's invisible, I'm going to make it visible. So with a function and other statements in JavaScript, these little curly braces are used. These curly braces or brackets or whatever you want to call them go around blocks of instructions that are done together. In other words, what this says is everything from here to here is part of that function. So all these lines of code get executed when you call the toggle menu function. How do I call the toggle menu function? I specify the name of the function and give it what it is I want to toggle. That value is put into this variable called arg. And wherever I refer to arg, I'm referring to whatever value I've given that function when I've clicked on it. So I have an if statement here. An if statement is what's known as a conditional statement. It evaluates something to determine whether it's true or false. There's two options with an if statement, true or false. If the condition is true, I do one thing. If the condition is false, I do something else. In this case, I'm looking to see if the display value for that argument, for the element that I'm toggling, if it's equal to block. Equal to block means that it's visible. If it is, then I'm going to do this block of statements. And I'm going to set the visibility to, or I'm going to set the display to none. And therefore, I'm going to hide it. So if I can see it, I'm going to hide it. Otherwise, if I can't see it, I'm going to show it. Now, you can put comments in your JavaScript code to sort of explain what's going on. And to put comments in, one way to do it is by putting 2 slashes. So I could say, see if item is visible. If so, hide it. If not, show it. Sometimes these are useful to explain what it is you're doing, and it's good to put comments in your code. So let's follow the logic through. This page loads. Everything initially, all the submenus have a display of none. So when this page loads, all the submenus are not displayed. So I only see the main menu items. I only see menu item 1. I don't see this submenu. See menu item 2. I don't see the submenu. I click it. I click submenu 1. I call this function and I call it with the argument submenu 1. So submenu 1 gets put into arg. I look to see if that submenu item has a display of block. Well, it doesn't. It's not visible. It has a display of none. Therefore, this is not true. So I don't do these instructions. I do these instructions, the else part. And I make the style of that element, make the display property block. So when I click on it the first time, it shows it. If I click on it a second time, it hides it again. Same thing will happen, except this time through, this is going to be true. And therefore, I'm going to execute the code to hide it. If I had to put this on every on-click event, I could do that. I could put this code right here. Something like looks something like this. But that would get to be very, very, very hard to read. And therefore, when you have more than just one instruction, it's generally better to create a function and address it that way. I'm just going to run down these examples. Feel free to stop me at any time to ask questions that you might have about them. For your last assignment, all I want you to do is to take one of these examples or another example that you can find online and make your version of it. All right, so I don't expect you to be an expert in JavaScript, but I do want you familiar with the capabilities of what JavaScript can do and understanding the role that JavaScript plays in comprising a web page. All right. Here I have an example, and it's a lot like the spoiler examples that we looked at. When there's an on mouse over display. So we won't go over that one in detail. This one we've already seen. In fact, we've seen a new and improved version of this where there's the ability to expand the the text size, so there's no need to go over this one. This one's a little bit different, so we will look at it. This one we do not use a function in, which it probably would benefit from using a function. And in fact, what I'll do is I will, no, I won't. Never mind. A couple things different about this. First of all, these menus are not based on the mouse over or the click, they're based on the mouse over. So when I put my mouse over, I'm going to be displaying that submenu. And I'm doing something else too. I'm changing the color of this to yellow. Whenever you see this in the programming, in any programming language, it means whatever element you're looking at. So this style background color yellow means this particular LI. We're going to change the color of. So we're going to set the visibility of the thing called submenu, but we're changing the color of the whole LI. We could also probably do a border instead. Let's do that. We can just add an extra instruction on here. By the way, this shows you the IntelliSense that is in Visual Studio Code. So it's a nice tool to use for web development, or really any kind of software development. So we give a little border around the thing that's shown. Border still stays there. Why? Because I didn't put anything in the on mouse out. And it gets rid of the border. Now notice though, if I do this for the second one and the third one, I didn't do it. Why? Because I have the individual JavaScript functions as part of the on mouse over and on mouse out instead of a function. So at this point where we have multiple instructions, it would be a good idea to go and write a function like I did with the other in the other example. I did this simply to show that you can change really anything about the page or anything about any of the elements on the page. All right. Here's a fun one. I think I did the same thing two different ways. Let's look at the first example. Things like this are often done like if you have a photo gallery where you can take and you can show thumbnails of the different photos and then show the full version of the photo when the user mouses over it. So let's look at the code for this one. And I think in this example, I put the CSS right in with the HTML, which is something I do when I'm teaching, but is a good idea, is not a good idea in practice. In practice, it's generally better to have a separate CSS file. So let's look at this. First of all, let's look at the HTML. Then we'll look at the CSS. And then we'll look at the JavaScript. So the HTML of the page, I'm going to remove the CSS, I think. The HTML of this just a list of pages, a list of images rather, and one big image. That's what we have. Unordered list of images, and then one big image, which is set initially to 1.jpg. Notice how I have for every image, I have a thumbnail version of this. There's several ways that you can do this. One of the ways I do this, though, is with a separate thumbnail image for every image. The good thing about doing that is you can edit the thumbnails to look anything if you want. If you have pages of different, if you have images rather of different dimensions, you could, for example, make all the thumbnails square. All right. Even if one was vertically oriented, one was horizontally oriented. So I actually went in with an image editor, and I made for each big image, 1, 2, and 3, I made a thumbnail image of it that's much smaller. This is 800 by 619. The thumbnail is 200 by 155. This is 548 by 514. This is 139 by 129, or 137 by 129. So they're all smaller versions. Let's add the CSS back in and see what it does. Puts these in nice little columns, side by side. So what I've done is I've taken the thing called thumbnails, given a width of 25% and floated it to the left. Every image in there, I've given a width of 100%. Now notice that's not 100% of the whole page. That's 100% of the thumbnails area. So it's 100% of the 25%. But I've given a maximum width of 130 pixels. So no matter how big I make this, the thumbnail doesn't get bigger than 130, but it can make it smaller than 130. and I get rid of the dots in the bullet point list. The big picture, I give a width of 60% width, that div, or section rather. I guarantee there's at least 15 pixels around it, margin. And I've said every image inside that is a width of 100% of that 60%, but a maximum width of 500. So it's never going to get bigger than that. Why do I have the maximum in there? Because at very big screen sizes, the size actually becomes bigger than the image itself, which it's not obvious probably from the screen. It's not even obvious looking at it here. But actually, if you display an image bigger than its actual size on disk, it will start to degrade the quality of it. So in this case, these images, I don't want to make bigger than 500 pixels the width, because the width of the size on disk is approximately 500 pixels for these. Now, where's the JavaScript come in? If I put my mouse over these items, I go and I change the element, which has an ID of big. I change the SRC property. Now, the SRC property is not a style sheet property. That is part of the HTML. That's an HTML property. I'm changing the source of the image to be this image file. So it starts off and it initially loads 1.jpg. I'm going to change it to either 1 JPEG, 2 JPEG, or 3 JPEG, depending on which image, which thumbnail I put my mouse over. Now, interesting thing is I don't actually have to create separate thumbnails if I use the width property, because even if I use the big picture for the thumbnail, it's still going to look the same. There are some implications on how the page loads, whether you use a separate thumbnail or use just a smaller version of the, just use the original image, but sized via CSS. If you had a whole bunch of thumbnail images, it might be better to create the thumbnails individually. Whereas if you have a relatively small number of, and if you think the user is likely to display them, then you can just go ahead and use the original image as its own thumbnail. Just size it via CSS. This, I think, does the same thing. It's just is based on clicking the image. Oh. This one I call a change image function, because I change not just the image, I change the alt text as well. That's one thing that this is not quite as good with, is this only changes the image when you hover over a thumbnail. It doesn't change the alt attribute. Really wouldn't give the person that's visually impaired too good of an idea of what's going on the page. This one, again, I have multiple instructions, so I change both the image and the alt attribute of that image called big. I've also added an access key. So for people with repetitive stress injuries or whatever, I believe if I do like Alt 3, it changes the image. So hand not on mouse, the people here can attest to this. Just by using the keyboard, I can access this. And this is valuable again for people using access keys in general are valuable for people that are visually impaired, because for some of them moving the mouse around can be difficult. It's also valuable for people that have certain kinds of motor control issues or repetitive stress injuries, because it's easier for them to keyboard than to click on the mouse. One of the things that JavaScript is also used for, especially in the past, know that there are things in HTML5 that allow you to do validation. You don't use it quite as often, but we can do our own validation code to make sure, for example, when we do a search, that there's something in the search box. So on this one, the event that we want to code some JavaScript to is called onSubmit. And we call it a validate form function. If this is a little difficult for you, again, take the time, review it. But if you don't get it, don't worry about it. If you take CISS232, we'll cover a lot more JavaScript than this, and you will understand this on a different level. This looks and make sure that there's something entered in the thing on the page with an ID of Q, which is this text box here. If there's nothing in there, we return false, which gets returned back to the onSubmit event, and the submit gets canceled. And we set the label to have a class name of error. We change the label from being its normal display of red or black, rather, to being red and in italics. And then we write must enter something in the inner HTML of this error span. So nothing entered here. We click this, the onSubmit event goes off. We call this. We see there's nothing there. We return false. We put this on the page and we change the class to error. This return gets sent back to the onSubmit, and that cancels the submission. So nothing entered, we don't submit it, we display, we change the class of the label and display this error message. We can also do some simple calculations with JavaScript. This does a calculation of if you enter in the radius of a circle, it will show you something. So if the radius is 1, circumference is 6.28 because it's 2 pi r is the formula for circumference. So if I have a circle that's a radius of 10, 2 pi r is 62.8. Again, this is interactivity. It happens without reloading a new page from the web server. So this doesn't get submitted to another page, so we have just a plain old button here. On click, we call calculate. We get the radius from the form. We get the element by ID called radius, which is this guy here. We get the value. If the value is not a number or there's nothing in there, we display that we must enter a number. Otherwise, we do the calculation and display the circumference of the circle. If you go on Canvas, there's a couple of other things for you to review for this week. Or for the last couple weeks, rather. There's more examples of JavaScript validation from W3 Schools. You can view. Does validation a little bit different way. And there's something called jQuery UI, which is JavaScript based, but allows you to do cool things with your user interface, your forms. For example, there's an accordion control. If you have different sections of the page you want to show and hide, you can make an accordion control. And this is done with only a very minimal amount of code. A little snippet of jQuery, which again, jQuery is a library that is built on top of JavaScript. These are cool things to review. Those are extra things though. Don't feel obligated to review them, especially if you're confused with some of the JavaScript stuff. So your last assignment is to incorporate some sort of JavaScript into the page. I gave you several examples. You can take one of those and build upon it, adapt it for your own needs, or find another example online. The big challenge for the rest of the semester, though, is you finishing your project. I do have expanded office hours both this week and next week. My suggestion for you is to try to pop on and review where you're at on your project with me. I can give you some tips and we can make sure you do a great job on your project. That's all I had today. Thanks for a good semester. This is the last lecture we'll have in class. Take care, and I hope to see you all in future classes.